Okay, yeah, so when you report a specific number, there's an inherent meaning behind each of these, which is some kind of specific. Think of this as like, I would be confident to this plus or minus, let's say 1%. And then here, plus or minus 0.1%. And then here, plus or minus 0.01%. So, this is something that's like I noticed on a lot of people's homeworks. You'll report this, but it's more important than, that's kind of whatever. But, you have to be careful about deciding what number to invest in future research, for example. Strong implications about how confident you are in a particular sort of answer. So let's see. Oh, is this working? Okay. So this is an example of like a typical sort of but when people report something like this, it is not sort of good practice to do this because you're saying, oh, I'm confident about this number all the way out to the, billionth place. So, reporting based on the accuracy of your data inputs is how you should be doing this. Does everyone know how we choose significant digits, significant figures? Anyone want to tell me how you would do this? Okay. So in your set of calculations, the general procedure is any input into a calculation, the one with the least number of digits is how many sort of significant figures that you should include in your final answer. Okay, so let me pull up. Our homework. Let's do, which one? Okay. This one with the plant growth one, right? So you guys, here we say there's 2.4 tons. So in this particular case, two sig figs, this is two sig figs, this only has one sig fig. If I wanted to have this answer at the same level of sort of precision as these other ones, I might say 8.0 meters, right? But let's assume that's like plus or minus 1, right? As we were saying. And so the final answer, I think that you calculator, it'll be 0.0069, yada, yada, yada. Rounded to 7, that's completely dependent on this, right? And so if I were to report 0069 here, right, and this was plus 1 meter in diameter up to 9 or down to 7, then that affects probably more than the 9 at the end of that, right? And so that's why we do this to report the same level of precision in our output as we do in our input. Does that make sense? Okay. So I don't think I really marked any points or anything off, but this is a important skill to keep in mind. Okay, let's close this guy. Hopefully the screen is still sharing. Doesn't show the green bar anymore, but okay. All right, so I'm gonna cover a quick sort of miscellaneous topic that I wasn't able to fit in with some of the transport stuff earlier. So we'll go over that really quick first, and then we'll move on to the main topic for today's lecture. So this is somewhat related to what we'll be talking about today later on infrastructure, but regarding the stock turnover. So when we're thinking about adoption and diffusion, this is relevant to understand sort of the stock of new technologies. This is based off of when we're thinking about how many new electric vehicles are coming into the market every year. This will allow us to understand kind of its effect on the overall fleet, like how many vehicles there are. So the way we do this, the total stock of vehicles in any given year is equal to its stock in the previous year minus how many are leaving. So this is what we call scrappage. That's like when a car gets retired, plus how many new vehicles are being sold. Scrappage is defined as 1 minus the survival rate. You can think of this as kind of your overall set population, and the survival is defined here. So 1 over 1 plus e to the k times age minus half-life. So age is the age of the vehicle, and then half-life. So this is a term that we use in, I guess, traditionally in chemistry, but also useful for like population dynamics. This indicates the length of time it takes for half of the vehicles to leave the population. Okay, and so how do we, what did I just do? There we go. So how do we figure out what this term is? You can do that empirically. So this is a plot of the survival curve where based on the vehicle's age, at 50%, this is about 12-ish years. Yeah. At 50%, that takes about 12 years for that to happen, which means the half-life is equal to 12 in this particular case. So that's how you would estimate that parameter. Okay, so there are, it's a sort of fairly simple procedure, but there are lots of sort of important models that have used this sort of technique. So in the transport world, the Vision stock turnover model is kind of well known for this. So folks who are interested in doing these sort of stock-based models, you can look at this. Developed by Argonne, it's like a spreadsheet stock turnover model, but it's got a whole bunch of different inputs that you can include here. And then you have sort of user specified sales shares of different vehicle technologies. So the nice thing about this is we can do all sorts of inputs for different fuel types. So if you want to look at new vehicle technologies like electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles, it's a pretty sort of easy tool to use. It's a spreadsheet based model. So here we can see kind of what's happening. In this column, you have the sales shares. So this is, if you think, oh, for new vehicles that are getting sold, it's going to have, 1% of the market, 2% of the market, whatever you want, right? And so this is what you might derive out of those diffusion models that we had talked about in a previous lecture. And then we can look at the survival curve that gets generated based off of some of those stock turnover parameters. Yeah, and the total vehicles ends up looking something like this. And that's based on this calculation of your share within the population. Yeah, there's a couple sort of more detailed parameters that you can adjust, things like this, usage by age. So this is like a thing where new cars get driven more, but older cars get driven a little bit less. And then you can kind of adjust those numbers and it'll figure out essentially what the vehicle miles traveled would be. We can also see, this is kind of a weird figure, but you can see how the overall technology for like a penetrating technology will increase over time. So if you just look at the overall shape, right, you're essentially what it's showing is that you have more and more vehicles entering the market and selling larger and larger shares every year. And this is a cumulative amount. And what happens is, let's say if I were to track the cars being sold in 2000, so this is age year 0, and the next one, it's going to be age year 1. And so that sliver gets older and older as you progress. And at a certain point, some of those vehicles will start to go away because they're getting scrapped. And then you can see, for example, if you look at just the year 0, in each line, that's telling you how many new cars are getting sold every year, minus any sort of small amount that somehow gets taken out of the market in the first year. Okay, and I should also mention that vision model from Argonne was also taken and adapted to use specifically in California. So there's actually a version of vision developed by the California Air Resources Board, CARB, specifically to model turnover for California vehicles. And they were particularly interested in looking at certain pathways, so hydrogen and electric vehicles. Yeah, and actually this has been used to help develop some policy regulation within the Air Resources Board. Okay, any questions about stock turnover? All right. So the main topic for today is going to be about fuel and energy supply infrastructure modeling. Okay, looking at kind of similar types of ideas where we want to think about transition for a lot of these newer fueling technologies and how this infrastructure can support new technologies for transportation. And we will think about this in the context as well of energy models in sort of a higher sense. We'll look at sort of existing systems and future alternative fuels, and then the requirements for each of those alternatives. Biofuels, hydrogen, and electricity are probably the most prominent today, some more so than others. Okay, so when we think about infrastructure for fuels, it's more than just like going to the gas station, right, and filling up your car with gas. There's a whole sort of upstream process of how we sort of produce that fuel and then end up getting that fuel to you, the sort of endpoint consumers, right? So there is resource supply, production and conversion, transporting that fuel, and then this is the station that people are probably more sort of personally familiar with. There's always this whole idea of having this boundary issue, right? If you're doing LCA, you should know all about this. A lot of studies, when they think about infrastructure for fuels, they mainly focus on starting with the conversion facility. So that's this point two. But sometimes you can think about including the resource supply as well. But for most conventional infrastructures, we think of this as kind of the starting point. Oftentimes, biomass and biofuels will include resource supply because it's a little bit the way that we sort of derive the resources for biomass and biofuels is quite a bit different, right, than extraction of traditional fossil fuels. And because oftentimes biomass and biofuels are thought of in this sort of cyclical way, at least in terms of sustainability, it's often important to keep in mind impacts on resource supply as well. Okay, and we'll talk about this endogenous versus exogenous topic down the line. Okay, so when we think about providing fuels, the infrastructure has to basically meet a few requirements. So you want an adequate supply of fuel at competitive cost. And when we think about this idea of competitive cost, that's an important principle for thinking about alternative fuels and the sort of relative costs of, say, hydrogen versus like a gallon of gasoline, for example. It may not come down to this like complex comparative analysis when you're thinking about this, but it's a good idea to have in mind sort of the implications of any cost result that you're having. And so, you do all this modeling and you figure out, okay, the cost of the hydrogen that I'm producing out of my model is like, let's say it's, $10 a kilogram. Okay, like what does that mean relative to what people are paying today, right? And so at $10 a kilogram, you're probably getting close to like double the price of gasoline, maybe. Well, these days probably less because gas is what, at like $5 a gallon now. So $10 a kilogram would probably be around $6 or $7 a gallon equivalent. So just having that context in mind, even if you're not explicitly doing that analysis, is important. Okay, reliable and robust disruptions. We'll see examples in the fossil fuel field about how big of an issue this was back in the 70s. And you can think about what that means for requirements in the future for other types of fuels. And then we want to think about environmental costs, security risks. There may be other factors to consider as well. But generally, these are the kind of requirements that you'd want. So fuel infrastructure is complex. It needs a lot of large capital investment costs, and they are oftentimes fairly long-term assets, especially when we're thinking about the energy production and conversion in traditional like fossil fuels. So if we think about then all the way down to the resource end, you have exploration, extraction, tankers and pipelines, and the transport, all refineries for conversion, pipelines for transport, and then refueling stations, right? That's a lot of infrastructure that needs to go into place for you to be able to get fuel into your vehicle. And then a lot of times these are fairly sort of complex networks. And so when you think about the sort of deployment and construction of infrastructure, it's not like, oh, I just go to my bulk storage terminal and then send out trucks, right? And then it's like a single point of import, right? You might have stuff coming in from pipelines and from tanker trucks. And they could be coming in from different refineries and so on. So these networks are not straightforward. And you want to minimize stranded investment, so you don't want to build something that doesn't end up getting used, and that can be a sort of big issue and a big hesitancy for new infrastructure. Okay, what does transport fuel look like today? Okay. So here we can see end-use transport. It's the bulk of it is coming from oil products. So this is kind of a version of like a Sankey diagram, but you can see. So for direct consumption of, say, natural gas, that is a sort of relatively small amount, as well as electricity, compared to kind of the size of this part, right, which is oil. So the vast majority of transport is coming from petroleum-based products. And hopefully the idea, so this is just one particular scenario in 2050. So this is a projection made by the International Energy Agency. The 2DS scenario. You can see that transport in this particular case, right, there's a larger amount coming from electricity. Still, the majority of it is coming from oil products, but then we also have sort of biofuels as the sort of energy input. I should also note that that the sort of number of miles driven by each of these is not proportional to the thickness of these lines, right? Because electricity going into your car ends up being a lot more efficient, right? You're talking about upwards of 90% efficient going into the motors, as opposed to oil products, which is closer to, say, 20% efficient. So yeah, the sort of translation into miles is going to be proportionally quite a bit different. But nevertheless, you know, this still shows that in 2050 we're using a fair bit of fossil fuel still in this particular scenario. Also mention that this plot is from I would say at this point a fairly sort of outdated picture, and I think that a lot of more up-to-date projections tend to, you know, have this electricity slices as being bigger, thanks to the sort of more recent success of electric vehicles. Okay, so what does refueling infrastructure look like today? So in the US, 160,000 service stations. Not all of these service stations are, you know, for the public, but generally you're on the 100,000-ish number of stations. And the average station gets about 1,500 vehicles per day, 5,000 truck stops. I've mentioned this before, we use a lot of gasoline every day, so 380 million gallons of gasoline per day, and then a little less than half of that in gallons of diesel per day. Most stations you see, so like Shell, Chevron, Arco, all of these stations, these are sort of branded and licensed, but most of them are actually just owned by small businesses. So they're kind of these franchise ownership models. And then most gas stations' profit is actually not from gasoline, it's coming from concessions. So drinks and snacks. Actually, the sort of profit margins that they get off of selling consumers' gasoline is fairly small. Yeah, and so that's sometimes surprising to some, but you can also think of the implications of this for sort of future fueling infrastructure as well, where the profit margins might be just as small or even smaller. Yeah. Yeah, so if I'm thinking about electric vehicles, right? There's this idea, well, are you going to make lots of money like selling electricity to customers from having them charge their vehicles, or are there better ways to try and sort of profit off of people coming to charge in public? Yeah, this is a question that I'm kind of interested in my work, where, you know, one of the things that I'm looking at is whether or not businesses that have chargers installed in their parking lots or nearby, if they see like an uptick in business compared to, you know, comparable businesses that may not have chargers installed. And if you think about it, like, okay, I sell electricity. If you buy it from the utility at like 20 cents a kilowatt hour, and if I am the business and I sell the equivalent electricity to someone who comes in to charge, and let's say I have them pay 25 cents. Okay, so you're making 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Let's say like the person's there for like an hour. So, you know, in a level 2 charger, you're making what, on the order of like 30 cents, right? That's not like a huge profit margin. But if that guy comes in, if it's someone who came to my store who wouldn't have come otherwise, and he buys, you know, a hamburger, okay, that's like a couple bucks right there, right? So yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that, like, for depending on the sort of modeling project that you're doing, if you're thinking about sort of the business end of things and the business model for infrastructure, oftentimes you're not making money selling the fuel.
So do you think we won't see like electricity stations, kind of like how we see gas stations right now, because it's not economic?
Yeah. So
they always have to kind of be attached to it.
Yeah, maybe. I think so. I think that people are coming around to this way of thinking because there is a lot of hesitancy for electric vehicle recharging, because they say, oh, you know, in my gas car, I can go to the gas station and I can just fill up my car in like 5 minutes, right? Who wants to sit at a station for 2 hours, or, you know, however long it takes to charge the vehicle? And so people are like, okay, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to buy an electric vehicle, right? But it doesn't have to be at a gas station. Like, who likes going to a gas station to refill their car? Anyone? No. So I have an electric car. I don't need to go to the gas station, and it's great. And I can just charge at home or charge at work. I can charge at the places that I actually want to go to. Yeah, so we're not actually going to talk that much about like business models today. It's like other things related to infrastructure. But yeah, this is a pretty interesting topic. And it's definitely one that's like not well developed or worked out. There's a, for electric vehicle charging, there's a big question about like, what is the business model? I can guarantee you no one is really making money right now off of selling electricity. It's all, yeah, incentives has helped a lot for selling these things. So if you want it to be sustainable in the future, right, there has to be some kind of, I guess, profitable business associated with it. And I don't think it's going to be gas stations, but I could be wrong. There are folks who think that extreme fast charging is the way to go. So that's like 300 plus kilowatt charging, which means that I can fully charge a 300-mile vehicle in about 10 minutes or so. And I think that is much more in line with the gas station type of model. And I think that will happen, but to a much smaller extent, because if I don't have to do it, then I probably wouldn't. But okay, again, that's my opinion. Yeah. Yes. These ones. Yeah. Yep. So, okay, from a modeling sense, that's not so bad because I can, like, let's say one of these boxes is renewable, and then that's kind of what goes into the sort of power and cogen plants for electricity. You could kind of, you could model it in a way that you would say, I have some amount of renewables and those go to provide power. I mean, the trend is that it will look like that as you have more and more renewables. In a like physics-based perspective, you can actually control like where electrons go, where electricity is coming from. So like our lights and the projector and all that, like, what time is it right now? It's like 10:40. So I can tell you right now in California, a bunch of solar is coming up, but right now probably there's a bunch of natural gas plants that are slowly ramping down. At 10, we might be close to, no, it's probably more than 50% solar right now. But at the end of the day, like I can't actually, no one would actually physically be able to tell you that like the electricity we have right now is coming from one source or the other. Like we can't actually do that.
Okay. If you were to scale this really down,
Mm-hmm.
how would you do that if you don't? If you were to successfully half of your electricity coming from solar.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So there. Okay. There's like an economic way of thinking about it, and then there's like a physical way of thinking about it. So maybe you guys have heard like, oh, I can buy renewable energy credits. And some universities do that. I think UC Davis does it. And so they say, okay, like 100% of the power that we use is coming from like solar or clean energy, or if you're in like a CCA and they say, okay, the proportion of power that we buy is a higher proportion of cleaner energy. So physically, that's not actually true, but economically it is, because they can guarantee that money is going to fund essentially renewable resource projects. The way the sort of market works out, like you can essentially say that you are sort of procuring energy from certain types of resources because you're paying specifically for that. And all of that sort of balancing will work out in such a way that the money will in theory sort of fund renewables. But physically, again, no one can actually, unfortunately, you can't actually be able to say with any guarantee that it's coming from renewables.
So you essentially pay a renewable power plant, be that solar or
yeah, exactly.
hydro, and so they actually do like physically put those electrons on the grid, but nobody knows where they go, but they're putting an equivalent.
Yeah. So you are paying them to operate. Yeah. So they are definitely like putting those electrons into the grid. It's just that you might not be the person getting them. Yeah. So that's how you should think about it. Okay. So let's go back to here. So current infrastructure. So one of the main thing to take away from this plot is that you'll notice, okay, here's the number of cars that we have in blue. Here's the number, here's the amount of gasoline we consume in red. Okay, so you've got upward trends here. And actually this differential, right, is because the fuel efficiency of vehicles is getting better. So even though the cars are going up, the gas doesn't increase at the same rate. And then the number of stations is in green, like this. So the number of stations doesn't necessarily correspond to the number of vehicles. Stations can be at sort of higher capacity. So that's one thing to sort of keep in mind. And you'll also notice that this downward trend really started happening in the 1970s, corresponding to the oil embargo and associated issues. And so gas stations tend to become sort of more efficient, have and see a higher number of customers. So this chart is a little bit old, right? This goes out to 2000. So as a sort of bigger update, you can see how that's changed over the last 2 decades. This is a terrible axis, so don't do this. Yeah, exactly. It's at about 100,000 stations, and then you can see the number of stations by fuel type. So for alternative fuels, so electric. So some people here would argue this number is probably wrong. We probably actually have close to 80,000 public chargers just in California today. Okay, and so actually, so I'll just quickly sidebar. Don't do this. Your y-axis should be at 0. It's a pet peeve of mine. Is truncating the y-axis misleading? No. Yes, but then, right. This accounts for 1%, not 50%. Okay, so don't do that. So past infrastructure. So back in the day, we used to have these, before you're sort of a lot more mainstream, you have sort of these distribution centers that are basically way more ghetto. It's funny, this kind of distributed service, we might be going back to something like this with electric cars, because you could just charge at home out of any old, right, 110 plug. So that I feel like kind of looks like this, but it actually works. So, and then we can see, the crazy sort of refueling infrastructure that they had back in the day. These little carousels. And obviously this looks pretty different from what it does today. Chicken and egg problem. Do we need the infrastructure first? Do we need the cars first? There's kind of this co-evolution with vehicle demand. So as you build out infrastructure, people become more confident in being able to use it without running out of sort of fueling supply. But you don't want a bunch of infrastructure that just gets deployed and kind of just sits there and doesn't do anything. That reminds me of there was this terrible company, Ecotality, in the early 2010s. The way the old incentives were set up for building electric vehicle chargers, the government used to just pay people to build the chargers. And so they would just build these electric vehicle chargers all over the place. They didn't care where they were located, and they didn't do any maintenance. And so a bunch of those stations just get deployed and then become defunct sort of immediately. And this company gets away with taking all these incentives, but then abandoning all of the chargers. Luckily, a lot of them kind of get recouped, and some of them get bought out, and a lot of them are back in service. But yeah, those are a problem with the way the incentives were structured.
Did they create the company once they heard about the incentives, or like, oh yeah, there's a niche there?
Yeah, no, it was like literally this random company that just like came in, built a bunch of chargers, took a bunch of money, and then pieced out. Yeah, the Blink, I think a lot of them got taken over by Blink. So the ones by IKEA in West Sac, those are Ecotality chargers. Okay, so building new infrastructure is a big challenge because you are competing with this sort of well-established incumbent. And it's not just this sort of direct competition, it's also this idea for consumers, like I, as like a gas car driver, I can say, oh, I would expect to be able to charge, to have charging infrastructure in the same way that I might have like gas stations. So at every exit, I want to be able to get off the freeway and charge my vehicle, right? So there's this kind of different mindset there that makes this competition, particularly difficult. So large capital expenditures might be needed for low volume fuel supply. So this is a sort of interesting idea, right? So the very first thing that you build costs the most money. And then as you get better and better at doing it, you become more efficient, you get better sort of production capabilities and cost savings. But it's kind of the opposite of what you want, right? Because it's such a low volume fuel supply, you're building it when not a lot of people need it or will use it. Yeah, challenges in building and maintaining fuel infrastructures. So, some people, like that company I was talking about, they just don't even care about the maintaining part. The consumer convenience and expectations and perceptions of the technology. Okay, so we'll go into specifics now about the different fuels. So the most widely used alternative fuel by a long shot is not electricity, it's actually ethanol, biofuels. And that's because gasoline cars actually blend ethanol into it. So when you get gasoline, it's not actually a pure mixture of gasoline. In the US, we consumed about 17 billion gallons in 2020. It's almost 1,000 barrels a day. There are some issues with going to higher ratios. So today we are at in California, the default is 15% ethanol. So when you buy gasoline, it's 85% gasoline and 15% ethanol. And ethanol has a lower energy content. So it takes about 1.5 gallons of ethanol to be equal to 1 gallon of gasoline. For diesel, we think about biodiesel. That's also very common, but for different applications. Yeah.
Mixing the ethanol with gas, does it make
Nope, no difference. And actually, so, okay, yeah, you're asking, okay, why do we put ethanol in gasoline? Yeah, because corn farmers are have a very powerful lobby. So, okay, that's not the only thing, right? I mean, we think about biofuels as this kind of, we'll say, quote unquote, renewable energy source. We'll talk about like much deeper implications about biofuels in a later course. But there is an effort by the Department of Energy to do things like reduce, improve energy security, right? So if I can import less oil, you know, that's better because I rely less on, you know, foreign governments and going to crazy wars and that sort of thing, right? So, you know, there are a bunch of synergies with using ethanol. You know, we think of it as a renewable resource. And so it's, I'm going to say, more sustainable than gasoline. Although, okay, well, I know this is a touchy subject. We'll talk about that a lot more in another lecture. Yeah, and so there are a lot of things kind of driving the sort of ethanol industry forward. Different ways of production of biofuels. So a lot of it is coming from corn, which we think has a lot of problems associated with it, but maybe if it's coming from a different sort of source, it might be not as bad. Yeah, okay, so. The most common alternative fuel vehicle in the United States also is not an electric vehicle, it is a flex fuel vehicle. So have you guys ever seen those cars that have like a little green leaf on it? Say, what does it say? Like clean fuel vehicle or like flex fuel vehicle. They have a bunch of different insignias and stuff. Okay, so these are flex fuel vehicles. There's 22 million of them in the US. And a flex fuel vehicle is basically exactly the same as a gas car, except it's got like a couple modifications. Like it has these special O-rings that don't dissolve. So a gas engine has no real issues using higher proportions of ethanol, but the ethanol can actually, you know, dissolve certain tubings and that sort of thing. It takes maybe about 100, 200 bucks of material to convert your car into a fuel vehicle. Yeah.
What's the difference in cost from like a driver's perspective?
Yeah.
Because it gets a lot lower mileage.
The mileage is going to be a little bit lower. It's usually not that big of a deal. Yeah, 20%. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, about 20% less. But yeah, so you're not really heavily incentivized to do that. Did I include the plot of? Let's see. Oh yeah. Yeah, we'll see this in a second, but yeah, this is the difference in price. And the E85 price parity with gasoline on an energy content basis would be this guy here.
Pretty close.
Yeah, it's not great, but yeah, it's close. Okay, but let me go back real quick. So there's 22 million flex fuel vehicles in the US, but most of them just drive on gasoline. Like how many of you guys have seen a E85 station before? Yeah, where was it?
Heading out to Berkeley, but I hadn't gotten
Okay,
there yet.
on the wall. Yeah, and then what? There's one in Davis. Oh, there is. I didn't even know that. Oh, okay. Wait, which station has E85?
highway.
Oh, on Mace?
No, not the other on it.
The other on-ramp, oh, there's the Shell there, and then there's the Chevron on the other side. Oh, okay. I didn't know that Chevron at the E85. I'll take a closer look next time. It's pretty rare to find an E85 station, especially on the West Coast. There are like 3,000 stations that offer them, but the vast majority of them are in the Midwest, where all of the corn is grown. So the relative amounts, these are some future projections, but you can see in the recent years. So this is the ethanol that's blended with gasoline. This is the E15, right? So your regular gasoline that you buy, and then that amount of ethanol is being sold in E85. So there's a bunch of flex fuel vehicles out there. They're not really using E85. Actually, I bet out of those 22 million people who have flex fuel vehicles, probably I would venture to guess that less than 1% of them would know that they could feel E85 in their vehicle. It's not like a big selling point when you go to buy your car at a dealership. Okay, relative fuel prices. How do customers choose between gas and E85? So this is, as I was mentioning, here's the price of gasoline in blue. In red is the price of E85, but because the energy density is lower, you may not necessarily prefer it. The price parity is here. So actually it's gotten, I guess, better. Well, this is an old graph. I wasn't able to acquire a newer plot than this. It's kind of hard to track E85 prices for some reason. Or at least together with gasoline. Okay, so where do these come from? So most of it is coming from natural oils and sugars and starches. So actually, as I was mentioning, from corn, you get this conversion, and a lot of it is going into this process to get ethanol. The sort of newer age, I mean, I wouldn't call it new age now. It's been around for a while, but the technology is not at a point where it's competitive enough to have huge amounts of it, but cellulosic biomass is a sort of a different way you can go about producing ethanol. Yeah, and I'll kind of leave this as a summary. We won't go too much into detail right now, but we'll talk about this in another lecture. Sure, that's fine.
I feel like wouldn't they make more money selling like instead of ethanol or like it's the same process, but with a lot of better technology.
All right, so we need to talk about supply and demand here, because if I produce, I think you're going to have trouble selling 14 billion gallons of whiskey. Yeah, so, the markets do a good job at okay, there's an important underlying point, which is again, something we'll talk about later, but the concept you should think about here is like substitution of goods, right? So what happens when the government pays farmers a bunch of money to produce corn ethanol for vehicles? You are substituting away from production of corn for other uses, and possibly other crops as well. Like maybe I'll switch from growing this type of thing to growing corn. So we don't, the vast majority of corn in the US isn't grown for consumption for like corn on the cob. It is used to feed livestock. Okay, and so feedstock prices go up if you do this type of thing. And that means the price of meat is now more expensive because we are subsidizing corn farmers to produce ethanol. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that happens as well, and we'll talk about that. But yeah, so it is a relevant thing, the substitution. It is actually probably one of the biggest problems with production of biofuels, actually. Okay, so that's biofuels. We can talk about EV infrastructure. So we use the electricity produced from our grid, and that goes to chargers, right? We had talked about this. I need to fix that. We don't call this level 3. This is DC fast charging. Yeah, but okay. So traditional fueling infrastructure, we have people traveling, they use up their fuel, then they go to a gas station and they fill up, right? But with electric vehicles, right, I can charge at home, I can charge in the workplace, I can charge in public. In reality, actually the vast majority of charging takes place at home. So I think the numbers are, so in terms of plug-in events, it's 85% of those plug-in events are home charging compared to these other two. And that might change in the future, but we'll see. So pricing, access, personal preference. These are the things that kind of drive the decision about where I'd want to charge. And that ratio can have different implications for how much infrastructure it costs and how much it costs you to charge, and emissions. One of the sort of interesting things about this is, like, we can think about how would I decrease emissions associated with charging? You can actually do it without changing the current portfolio of generation, right? If I have a lot of solar, right, I can build more workplace chargers, which induces people to charge at work. And because they charge at work during the day, they're using more of that. But if you build a lot more home chargers, that tends to happen in the evenings, where maybe you have more sort of natural gas generation. So there's this interesting thing that you can do where you can try and manipulate the infrastructure itself to reduce emissions without even having to mess with, like, pricing or the upstream generation. Yeah.
Is this the case for US or other countries, like home charging?
Oh, yeah, good question. Actually, I'm not sure what it looks like in other countries. Europe might look similar, but I would imagine, say, the big one is in China. Yeah, actually, I have no idea what China looks like.
So is the home charging happening in the urban area or?
All over. I mean, yeah, I would. The thing is, most of the electric vehicles are going to be located in cities, just because of the way, populations kind of work out and are distributed. But yeah, but in both cases, yeah, the majority is going to be at home. Yeah. okay, so this is actually what I was kind of talking about. So this is based off of this survey back actually before there were that many electric vehicles. But we can think about places, when people are driving, which is this black line, and then when people are in other places and where the access would be. And so this kind of denotes why you can see so much of it is at home. This sort of lighter gray area is, we can think of it as like cars sitting at home. Yeah.
Like a typical electrical service like for a home? Like we're talking like 20 amps, 30 amps? For 2 volt?
Yeah, so are you talking about like the household in aggregate, or
well,
yeah?
Obviously, your charger's gonna have to be less than.
Yeah. So I mean, I would estimate that. Okay, I don't know the numbers for sure, but I would say the average is probably 20 to 40 amps.
So like the average driver who's charging at home, pretty much the max they're gonna be able to charge at. Maybe 30.
Yeah, but okay, yeah. So here's the thing. Your car is probably sitting at home maybe 18 hours a day.
You got a lot.
Yeah, you don't.
People don't drive 300 miles a day.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So the average driving distance a day is about 30 miles. So, there are a lot. We actually make recommendations for people who buy electric vehicles. They say, oh, do I need to install a level 2 charger? And you say, okay, maybe, but just try level 1 for now and see how it goes, right? Level 1 is just plugging into your wall outlet. So you don't need to install anything new. You don't need to, you most likely don't need to upgrade your breaker. You don't need to be running at like 20 plus amps to charge your vehicle because it's there for such a long time. Yeah, so commuting behavior, home is the most popular charging location. So this is based off of some survey work that's done here, looking at how different types of electric vehicles and different locations kind of how does that play out. And so there's this whole slew of interesting things that you can look at: where they charge, when they charge, how much they charge, how often they charge. And so there's a lot of work being done here to suss that out. And I think this has important implications for modeling. So this is where you kind of want to have a good sense of like underlying behavior. So there's a lot of like modeling work that says, let me take an electric vehicle, and the way that I'm going to like simulate the energy use associated with electric vehicles is I'll see how it travels in a day, drive it home, plug it in, charge it all the way up to full, and then the next day do the same thing over and over again, right? But there are all these like nuances in the behavior that we observe from survey data, such as these guys, they drive home and then they say, okay, I'm not going to bother plugging it in because I still have like 200 miles on my vehicle. So very, very few electric vehicle drivers that we have ever observed charge every day. That's just doesn't really happen. And so that's one already sort of big difference with the way that oftentimes modelers will assume these things happen. So keep some of these things in mind if you are working in this domain. EV infrastructure challenges, availability of home recharging, longer recharging time, availability in public. So these are things that people think about as sort of problems with the sort of new infrastructure that we have to deal with. Some of these things might be very real challenges. Some of these might be things related to consumer perception, which is still an important consideration. There are other ways you can refuel an electric car that you may have heard of. So battery swapping is one of them. I'm not a big believer in battery swapping. There's been some academic work that shows the economics of doing battery swapping is very difficult / impossible to work out. Yeah, so people have done these analyses where you have like a gas station type of thing where cars will drive in, you battery swap, and then they do the economic analysis of like, okay, how many batteries would I have to keep on hand? And how many cars would need to be coming through the station? Or depending on how many cars are coming through the station. And there's like not really any scale of that where you can feasibly make any money, or you can feasibly not lose tons and tons and tons of money. So yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, so like it's kind of, yeah, I've heard of that. But it's kind of like the battery swapping thing, right? Like the $10,000, that's where you run into your problem, right? Because it's like, I can do that, or I can pay $5 to recharge my vehicle. Yeah, so, I mean, there are companies that are trying to do this, and maybe they'll be successful, and maybe I'm gonna eat my words in a couple of years, but I have seen a lot of these papers and they don't tend to do well. Yeah.
But they also, aren't they gigantic?
Yeah.
Tesla actually the whole car. Like,
yeah. What kind of battery does a Tesla use?
And they have like different
yeah. They're like built into the car. So part of the battery swapping will rely on automakers coming together saying, hey, let's all use the same kind of battery. Hey, let's be able to slide them out of the car really easily, right? A lot of them are like literally bolted into the frame, and it just, yeah. Yes.
What do you think about battery swapping for smaller vehicles?
I mean, if you want to spend all that money to get another battery, sure, I guess. I don't know.
Like on like the public scale.
Yeah. No, but that's the thing is like the rate at which you do the exchange, how much you would charge for them, and then the like inventory that you would need to like feasibly do like a turnover where people would use the service. Like I haven't seen any analysis where that ever works out on any scale. Because like batteries, the like capital costs associated with batteries is just so expensive. Like if you got like an electric bike today, like easily half, if not more of that cost is like literally just the battery. So yeah.
So I don't know how to start asking, but if I was buying all these people that doesn't Tesla,
Mm-hmm.
from like checking and one of them hardware, how do you use one? Because I'm sure different types, like different companies,
Yeah. No. That's okay. So that's right. So if you're talking about like charging at home and you just want to like a charger at home, there's two like levels that you can get. One is a level 1 charger and one's a level 2 charger. So the level 1 charger, you just plug into an outlet and plug into your car. No big problems there, but there are 16 gajillion different companies that sell them. And you know, some of them are going to have higher or lower build quality. I don't know, like a good, I mean, Amazon reviews, I guess. Yeah, well, okay, so actually, okay, so if you buy an electric vehicle today, it will, any electric vehicle you buy will come with a level 1 charger for free. So you could just use that one. I had one, my car got broken into and it was stolen, and then I bought a new one on Amazon and it works fine. And I just got like the one that's highest reviewed, I guess. That's how people can do it. The level 2 is a little bit more complicated. So you can think, so level 2 operates at a higher voltage, so it would plug into something like a dryer plug. Don't actually do that, consult your electrician. But yeah, it's so there are probably, you know, dozens, if not hundreds, of companies that sell level 2 as well. And there are characteristics of the level 2 that you would probably want to pay a little bit more attention to. Some of them can operate at, you know, higher slight. So some of them will have higher sort of charging powers, and then there are like safety things associated with them. It ends up being like another sort of like heterogeneous consumer product, and you know, I'm sure you can find reviews and stuff like that of different like popular chargers. Yes. No, in California, they're not specific. So if you own and register an electric vehicle with almost any utility in California, because of an incentive program called LCFS, the utilities get paid money for proving that someone has an electric vehicle in their service territory. And that money is supposed to go to consumers. And so part of that money that they get helps subsidize anyone who buys a level 2 charger. No, yeah. Yeah, it's actually, it used to be something like up to $1,000 back, which usually more than covered it. Not always, because sometimes you need to do an electrical upgrade. But yeah, the incentives were pretty good. Okay. Factors affecting charging infrastructure use. So access to chargers, trip and driver characteristics, right? You can imagine that certain type of people will much more prefer to charge at home versus charge at work. You know, if I drive a lot, maybe I'm not going to be able to charge at home. Cost of charging in alternative locations. You know, if you have the availability in many different places, maybe you would just prefer to charge at the place that's the cheapest. That's like definitely true for me. I have an electric car. I do not charge at home. I charge at work because it's free. So, you know, this can influence where you use it. The vehicle technology and range is actually a really big one. So we observed that people who drive plug-in hybrids compared to full battery electrics, they charge much more often. And that's because the sort of overall battery size is smaller. So you're sort of emptying the battery a lot more often, and you need to charge it up. And then the convenience of charging at alternative locations. You know, maybe I'll prefer certain places because I don't have to go out of the way to drive there. Yeah, separate models for battery electric and plug-in hybrid commuters. How much does it cost for installing a charger? So 12 cents per kilowatt hour. That might be the sort of cheapest you could possibly get in the US. In California, you're probably looking more at like 21 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's the sort of price of electricity. But then, as we were mentioning, this is the cost of a home charger installation, sort of on average. If you were to just buy, so okay, I'll say this chart is definitely a little bit older. If you just buy the box itself, that's this blue thing here. And that price has come down probably a couple $100 on average. But if you're doing a level 2 installation, which this is, you probably want to have an electrician come in to do it for you. So there's some permitting, mobilization, electrician labor, and then other sort of hardware. And obviously this will kind of vary. And as I was mentioning, in California, basically all of this can get covered by the utility. They'll pay like $1,000 to $1,500. Yeah. So home, no equipment needed. Level 2 is probably closer to $400 to $700 for the charger, but then you have to pay an electrician to help you with that. This might jump up like $1,000 if you have to upgrade your panel. You have to go to like 20 amps to 40 amps or something. Okay, what about workplace and public charging? So we have sort of immediate economies of scale if you install more than one sort of plug at a specific location, right? Because there's a lot of overlap in some of these costs. So this is like a parking garage installation versus a curbside installation. So we can think about, oh, why is the parking garage so much cheaper? And actually, it has to do a lot with labor costs. Oftentimes in a parking garage, you have easy and immediate access to the electricity. Usually there's a sort of transformer right there. But for curbside installation, oftentimes you have to do trenching depending on how close or far it is. So this is all for level 2. So compared to your household, right, this type of thing could be several times more expensive. So we're talking about on the order of, let's say, $4,000 per plug up to $9,000 per plug at level 2. So there's variation in sort of the same hardware costs. The charging station hardware itself is going to be a little bit more expensive. That's because a lot of the public chargers tend to be a little bit more robust. Sometimes they're outdoors, they're more exposed to the elements. And so the hardware ends up being a little bit more expensive. DC fast chargers, way more expensive. So we're talking about really sort of high voltages, right? And that requires oftentimes a lot more electrical equipment. So you need a sort of transformer as well to get up to your 400, 480 volts. And so that's going to contribute a lot in terms of expenses. And so this is what we say is sort of a typical cost. I think this is actually probably lowballing it. 60K is, I would argue, probably like the absolute cheapest you could possibly get for a DC fast charger installation. Yeah, and so we can see a sort of breakdown of all of these things for home, parking garage, curbside, and the DC fast charging. And some of the materials that you would require for like a DC fast charger is way more, or you wouldn't need in other examples, such as a transformer.
Does fast charging put any strain on your?
Yeah, so technically, yes. Yeah, so physically it definitely does, but it's not that big of an issue these days. One of the things that they do is there is a larger sort of buffer range at the bottom and top state of charge that you're basically not allowed to access. So if your battery is let's say hypothetically you have a 100 kilowatt hour battery, they might say you can only go from 15% state of charge up to 85% state of charge. And as batteries sort of operate in that buffer range, it's a lot more robust to issues related to sort of faster charging, higher temperatures, that sort of thing. The degradation is sort of substantially decreased. So if you only charge your electric vehicle on 50 kilowatt all the time and you subject it to these like heavy duty cycles, the degradation will be accelerated for sure. But people, this was definitely like a big concern. People were thinking about this, but empirically that degradation hasn't seemed to be very sort of prominent. We've looked at vehicles that do lots of fast charging. We've looked at the rate of degradation of their battery, and it's like mildly more maybe than vehicles that just charge normally. Yes.
So relative to all the
I do not know how much a gas station costs. I mean, a gas station is going to cost more than $60,000 or $70,000 for sure, but it's difficult to have that kind of comparison because gas stations are operating with sort of much higher throughput, and like the number of dispensers that at a gas station is usually way higher than the number of plugs that you would find at a charging station, usually, not always. Yeah, so I don't actually know the numbers. If I were to sort of venture to guess, I would say that like the sort of levelized per energy dispense, the gas station is probably going to be cheaper. You don't need nearly as much. Well, I shouldn't even say that. Like the hardware that you need for a gas station is pretty different. So I will leave it as I don't know, but I'll look into it and I'll get back to you on that. Okay, as I was mentioning, the DC fast charger $70,000 thing is I think sort of the cheapest. I have a student working on a project with Caltrans where we're getting all this like cost information for deployments of real world DC fast chargers at rest stops. Rest stops are probably the least ideal place, right? A lot of them don't even have electricity going there. So a bunch of stuff needs to happen sort of on the utility end as well. So these are estimates of costs at rest stations, which probably represent the sort of upper end of DC fast charging stations. So these guys are on the order of 600,000, 500,000 per charger. Okay, per charger. So yeah, you can look at some of these schematics where the utility sets up a transformer at one of the rest stops, and then who's been to a rest stop on like Highway 5 or the 99? Okay. When you're driving on the freeway, what does the rest stop look like? Yeah, and you, yeah, but you pull off to the, let's say you're southbound and you go to the rest stop and you pull off, right? Is the northbound also going to the same rest stop? No, it's on the other side. There's two rest stops. So I have to go from the transformer that gets set up on one side of the freeway and dig a trench under the highway to get that line there. And that's this gray line here. These are the make ready costs. Things like setting up the wiring, the like labor and materials to set up the trenching, right? Digging under the freeway is like really friggin' expensive. So these things can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars just to set up one charger.
They can't do a over the freeway.
No.
Because it's TTP.
No, I don't think you're allowed to run wiring over the freeway, I think. Yeah. No, I don't. I think you're not allowed to run distribution lines over the freeway. I think that's like a law or something. I don't think you'd be able to do that. Yeah. So the other end of the spectrum here. Okay. How do we determine emissions impact of charging EVs at any given time? I think we've talked a little bit about this, right? So the grid electricity is this market mediated process. So it's, again, hard to determine where the electricity is coming from. And so depending on the time of day, this is a dispatch curve example. So, you know, bunch of nuclear and renewables, and then hydro, and then natural gas at the top. And so depending sort of on the time of the day that you might be charging, you know, the allocation of power from different sources will change. Yeah. Okay, so that's hydrogen or electricity infrastructure. I have one quick thing to say for CNG stations. So this is compressed natural gas. So there are actually some vehicles that run on CNG. A lot of it uses existing natural gas infrastructure. And you can have, there are sort of unique aspects of this infrastructure. You need sort of gaseous fuel storage. And so there are a couple different types of stations that can refuel. So you have a fast fuel station. Essentially, the way this works is that you have a bunch of sequential sort of storage devices so that you can run at these higher pressures, dispense into a vehicle, and then sort of quickly be able to fill up the storage again to dispense fuel, and then time fuel stations where there's a buffer storage, right? But then the sort of gas compressor is a lot larger so that it can fill up that buffer storage. And these guys typically are going to be refueling for larger size vehicles. Not going to spend too much time with CNG. It's not a sort of heavily used alternative fuel. But the last one we'll talk about today is hydrogen pathways. So hydrogen is pretty interesting from the thinking about the sort of upstream pathway. It can actually be derived from basically any primary energy source. And so most commonly, the way it's made today is through natural gas reformation. And so that is a fairly carbon intensive process. So this wouldn't be considered, I would say, clean hydrogen. You can also make hydrogen from electricity through a process called electrolysis. And if you're using renewable sources to power that electricity, then you would have, I guess, what people refer to as green hydrogen, which is clean. So yeah, these are your conversion methods. So from a hydrocarbon conversion or from electrolysis through converting from water essentially to make hydrogen. And then the two main sort of production pathways from an infrastructure perspective is to do on-site hydrogen production. So what that means is you can think about if I go to like a refueling station, so your equivalent of a gas station, like all that hydrogen is getting produced right there on site. And so we call this distributed production. And then there is centralized production where you would have, say, a much bigger production facility that is making hydrogen that then gets either piped or driven by truck to your distribution network. Centralized production is going to more efficiently produce the hydrogen, right? Economies of scale and that sort of thing. But it has to, the infrastructure costs are significant because you have to have all the transportation of your fuel from your production facility to your distribution. But in an on-site, okay, yeah, you have less efficient production, but you get to forego any of the transportation because it's like right there. So if you look at studies of hydrogen, there's lots of discussion of kind of both of these. And it's not entirely clear which one's better. In fact, a lot of analysis shows that in certain places, it's better to do distributed. In certain places, it's better to do centralized. I'm not going to go through all of these. Maybe you can kind of have this as a reference, but the main idea here is that the like configuration and design of a particular infrastructure station can vary quite a bit. So even if you are doing like distributed, right, you could have a station, a localized station that's doing electrolysis, right? So you have an electrolyzer that takes in water and electricity, produces hydrogen. You could have a totally different thing, a reformer station, where you are getting natural gas and air, and you are going through this steam methane reformation SMR process to produce hydrogen that then that you can then dispense. So like really sort of different ways of going about it. And then you could have a pipeline station, so centralized process gets piped into the station. These all have different implications for like how I'm going to size the station, right? How much area that I need. You can imagine that if I have like a steam reformer, the size of my lot that I have to buy is like way bigger than if I just had a pipeline coming in. So also things to consider. It is currently a sort of less mature technology, I would say, but the infrastructure does exist. There are on the order of, I think, 60 or 70 hydrogen stations in California now, with a lot more sort of planning to get installed. Oh yeah, right here, 62, I guess. For some reason, I have 74 in my head, but there are several stations that are already planned for deployments, as we can see. And a lot of these relate to sort of policy targets. And the idea is like, okay, we want to hedge our bets. Maybe we're not sure if hydrogen is going to be the one that's going to be the most successful in the future. So we're going to have policy support to build them out, and then we'll kind of see what happens. Hydrogen stations are like gas stations in the sense that, like, unlike with an electric car where I would charge for a long period of time, these you drive up, plug it in, and refuel in on the order of like 5 to 10 minutes, similar to a gas station. So I think hydrogen stations, which would much more closely follow the gas station model. Does anyone know where the closest hydrogen station is to us? West Sac, yes. Yeah, our fearless leader, Dan Sperling at our institute, he had a Mirai for a little while. He had leased a Mirai, and so which is a Toyota's hydrogen car, and he would have to drive out to West Sac all the time to refuel the vehicle, or he would have other people do it.
Can you make hydrogen? Hydrolyzed water?
Yeah. That's electrolysis.
Can you do it with? Or does it have to be like distilled?
No, it definitely has to be distilled. Yeah. So, yeah. So the way this works is, you have this electrolyzer that essentially you put in H2O and electricity, and then it'll have two streams of outputs where one is hydrogen and one is oxygen. And this electrolyzer here is a platinum-based catalyst. It's one of the problems. Platinum's really expensive. So you need a pure stream of water passing through the catalyst. It actually should look more like that. And if you have impurities in it, you're gonna totally mess up your electrolyzer. It's yeah, that would be a really, if you put seawater into your electrolyzer, you would mess it up like very quickly. Yeah. Not recommended. So yeah, that's, you know, that makes it a little more expensive to use distilled water, but the water probably isn't the most expensive part. It's probably the electricity and energy associated with this, and the fuel cell itself is really expensive. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right there.
Yeah. So I'm thinking if I were down early, I'll have a very tough time getting from Davis all the way to Colorado.
No, you can do it. That if you didn't have that one, then you'd be screwed. But because that one's there, it's all right.
Are there plans? Because like California or Washington, they have things on the West Coast.
Yep.
I'm wondering if West Coast.
Yeah. No, there isn't. But there are plans to deploy more sort of along that corridor. The thing that really sucks, that make people not want to do that trip is no, you don't know if the station is down.
Reliability for it.
Yeah, hydrogen stations have notoriously bad reliability. So, you know, you might be on your way, you get down here and you're like, uh-oh, like the station's out. Yeah, I can't even tell you how many times like we go to West Sac and then like the station is down. Like it's not working. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know why. I guess like I don't know technically like what's the reason for that. But like, yeah, sometimes it's just empty, but like you drive up to it and the like thing just like is off or it doesn't work. So actually the funny thing about that one, the pressure gauge in West Sac, on the one of the dispensers was broken. So like it would just, the needle would keep going up. So you'd like put it in and then you're supposed to get up to like, yeah, I mean, these things operate at pretty high pressures, but the gauge would keep going up and it would start redlining and you'd be like, like, is this still okay? Like, I don't, yeah. So there are some problems. I mean, that happens with all refueling stations, to be honest. Like there are definitely times where I go to a charger and it's just like down and it kind of sucks, but like, you know, the reliability aspect is an important one. I mean, gas stations too, right? Like I'm sure you guys have driven up to a gas station where you like put it in and then it says like out of service or whatever, right? So that happens everywhere. Sorry, did someone have a question over here? Okay. Yeah, consumer convenience is critical, and reliability is really important. Availability is a significant barrier to adoption. So as I was just saying, like maybe you guys would be hesitant to buy or to lease a hydrogen vehicle if you have to go to Westac to refuel it, right? Maybe if there was one in Davis, it'd be different. But that's the kind of, thought process that people think about. Unfortunately, right, the way that works, chicken egg type of thing, early infrastructure is sort of always going to be sparse. For gas stations, they have the ability to, or they've been around long enough where the convenience thing isn't really an issue. There's so much redundancy where if a gas station is out, for example, I can just go to the next one. Okay. So infrastructure analysis. So things to think about. The spatial aspect of infrastructure analysis is often really important. Thinking about the location of the infrastructure relative to where it's needed, economies of scale, convenience, and for a lot of the new technologies, thinking about these transitions at different demand levels is going to play a big role in the way that infrastructure gets deployed. So this is, we're kind of hitting on some of these points that we've been talking about. For coverage, I showed that the map with these 64 stations, and there's lots of work all the way spanning back to the 80s, thinking about, okay, how could I deploy infrastructure in such a way that I alleviate the user concerns? And so some findings about, okay, if they look like kind of the way diesel stations are covered, then concerns about fuel availability get reduced a lot. Same for CNG. Again, we don't need like analogous coverage as gas stations. If you get to the point where you're like 20% of existing stations, it would be sort of sufficient. And I think a lot of this analysis is mainly pertaining to this gas station model. Like these are not the type of numbers that you would apply for something like electric vehicle charging, where the way in which refueling is really different from gas stations. Station siting. So Mike Nicholas did this nice paper. So this guy is a alum of UC Davis from the TTP program. And so he had done this analysis looking at, okay, the amount of driving that I have to do to get to the nearest station sort of decreases with this kind of function as I increase the number of stations. This is a really sort of typical type of thing that you find that it scales off exponentially. I've done analysis for electric vehicles that looks exactly like this. Yeah, number of minutes to nearest station, same type of graph here. And so they did this analysis of like, okay, based off of the way people commute in Sacramento, like where would I need to place the stations within the county of Sacramento? Yeah, so this is like one kind of strategic way. If you have information about the way people are traveling from point to point, you can figure out essentially how you would handle that coverage and deploy infrastructure stations. Clustering strategy. This was looking at introducing stations in Southern California. Yeah, so this is one way that you can think about dealing with this chicken and egg problem, is to identify the sort of attractive geographic areas, places where we also think that there's both an intersection of people traveling and where people would buy or use hydrogen vehicles. And so they came up with this sort of analysis to look at these sort of maps. And these are all sort of influential to policymakers and trying to figure out where to deploy stations. Thinking about refueling inconvenience. So there's this idea that the deployments can influence the purchase behavior of alternative fuel vehicles. This is kind of interesting. You can try and elicit essentially like a monetary penalty for coverage of stations. And you can use this in some kind of like spatial optimization algorithm in order to sort of figure out how much to deploy. And so this shows kind of these curves about percentage of coverage. You can think of it like that, percentage of coverage versus the cost of like the inconvenience to drive. So I think these are sort of a handful of different approaches that different modelers have taken to try and figure out both how many stations to deploy and sort of where to deploy them. There's actually, well, maybe more with the previous slide. This one, there was a project where we went around asking a bunch of potential buyers or people who are about to buy electric vehicles. And we asked them, okay, like, where would you like to install like a charger? And we gave them like a certain number of options for how many chargers that they could install. And they built them like everywhere, all over the place, all the places that they could possibly travel. And then we went back to them later after they had bought an electric vehicle. And then we observed where they would actually charge. And they would probably use, you know, out of the like 10, 15 chargers that they said that they would like to have, they'd be charging at locations corresponding to like 1 or 2 of them. So people think that they need more than they actually end up using. Yeah, so let's end here today as the last slide, sort of modeling, fueling infrastructure, sort of key questions to think about. You know, how detailed do you want your study to be? And I think you should let the sort of question that you're trying to answer help drive the complexity needed in the model, right? You might not necessarily need like a total spatial deaggregation of your infrastructure, depending on what you're trying to do. System boundaries for the analysis. What am I going to include in thinking about the infrastructure? I think this is probably more pertinent for like hydrogen or biofuel types of analysis, going sort of how far upstream do you want to go? The endogenous versus exogenous issue, this is the idea of like, how much am I going to factor in like just scenario-based prices where I think the prices of fuels are going to be in a certain way, or if you want to actually figure out how it's going to compete with sort of alternative fuels and how that gets affected with the ultimate price that ends up happening. This is a really hard thing to do, very complex. Do we include the demand? And then issues with scale as you build more, do they get cheaper? Yeah, and so also, what am I going to be looking at? Do I mainly care about how much it costs to build? Do I care about like upstream emissions? Do I care about optimizing the system design? These different objectives can kind of drive your analysis in different ways as well. Okay, So I'll leave you guys with those thoughts for today. Yeah, administratively, I guess, homeworks are due at the end of the day today. So make sure to get those in. And then the projects are due on the 8th, or no, 10th, I said the 10th, right? So next week. So make sure to, chat with me about that. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right. Yes, we have an announcement today.